the lack of response plays into the hands of people that would want to make the path to reconciliation harder and more difficult. And that's my concern. My concern is that from a policy perspective, we should be much more active on this, not only because arson is a crime and it's dangerous and it has a property cost, but also fundamentally because it could endanger our path to reconciliation, which is tough enough already. So we have to be able to be active on this, to be able to ensure that there are no reasons why people should be opposed to reconciliation as a result of the church arsons, because some people are using it from that perspective.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ken Coates. I'm the director of the Indigenous program at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Absolutely delighted to be with you today and introduce you to a very special report that we just released a matter of a couple of days ago. I'm joined by the author of this report, Edgardo Sepulveda. And Edgardo, forgive me for mispronouncing your name a little bit. The report is quite a fascinating discussion, very fascinating discussion of the church burnings that followed in the wake of the announcements of undiscovered Indigenous graves at former residential school sites. Well, remember, this was a cause célèbre, quite frankly, around the world that got, quite frankly, the residential school process is one separate thing. This story got out of hand and got exaggerated by particularly outside of Canada. But the paper that Edgardo did is called A Scorched Earth, a quantitative analysis of arson against Canadian religious institutions and its threat to reconciliation. And Edgardo, it's wonderful to have you with me today. What actually, by the way, is my final act as the director of the Indigenous program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And so we're ready to go out with something as important and provocative as this particular study. So Edgardo is a columnist. He's a journalist. He's written lots of things in lots of different places. But what he does is a little bit different. And quite exciting is he's really a data-rich kind of guy. He looks for the substantial evidence to go beyond the sort of the rhetoric and the noise that sort of comes up there, and looks at the background sort of side. So I'm going to start by saying hello, and Edgardo, just maybe introduce yourself a little bit further.
Great. Thank you, Ken. I didn't realize that you were leaving the program, so I'm glad I just got in under the wire. It's been a pleasure working with you, and thank you again for agreeing to have this paper published by the MLI, because I've been interested in this topic for a couple of years. I mean, which Canadian couldn't be interested about this issue? It was the number one issue in 2021. As designated by the Canadian press. So in terms of background, I was born in Chile. I studied economics here in Canada, and have been working as a consulting economist for about 30 years now, mostly working on data and specific sectors such as telecommunications, electricity, inequality, and now most recently arson. So great to be having this chance to write the report and to be on this podcast with you.
Well, it's great to have you with us. So maybe let's start by setting the stage a little bit. People will remember that back in sort of 2021, that there were a whole bunch of revelations about residential schools. We have had this going for a quarter century or longer in Canada, as we try to sort of build reconciliation around truth and understanding. And it started in Kamloops, where Kamloops identified the possibility that there were remains in right close to the residential school. And we know there were a substantial number of children that over the decades had actually died there. So it's not as though this was a hidden thing, but nobody had found the graves. And there was something incredibly poignant and touching and moving about the idea that these graves had disappeared over a period of time. And in the aftermath of that, we had a spate of church burnings that were just so unusual in Canada. When people attack a synagogue for good reasons, when the people attack a synagogue, there's a really public outcry for very good reasons. People are mortified that the anti-Semitism, what that led to that. When people attack a Muslim place of worship, there's a pretty strong reaction to it. What really stood out in this case is when the arson took place, and it was many arsons. We'll ask you that first, is how often they were, how many there were. What's really interesting is that there wasn't the same kind of public outcry. There was a bit of it, particularly from First Nations, particularly from the church itself, but public didn't get engaged as much. So let's start by talking about that. How many church burnings were there?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, in Canada in 2021, you could not, ignore the wall-to-wall coverage of Kamloops and then subsequent series of other announcements. So what I found was that there was, put it this way, arson is a fact of life, and arsons at religious institutions is a fact of life. We have what we call background or baseline arson, both of buildings in general and also of religious institutions and churches. We'll talk about the distinction later on once we get into discussing the data. But what we found was that in addition to that baseline, we saw a very significant spike, a doubling or tripling in 2021 and 2022 and 2023. And so that spike captured the imagination and the concern of a number of people. But as you say, it also did not capture the attention of policymakers and of police and fire services in the way that one would think it should have. And so that part of my motivation for doing this and writing this report is to raise the profile of these arsons and argue for a number of reasons why we should, as Canadians, pay more attention to it, and we should have a robust policy response to these arsons.
So when I followed these stories, and there were lots of them. We're not talking here about two, and we're not also not talking about 2,000. So we usually get a sense of the number we're talking here.
Sure.
Is they were treated very seriously at the local level. So if it happened in northern Alberta, if it happened in northern British Columbia, if it happened in Saskatchewan, they were big stories. Because these churches were often historic buildings.
Mm-hmm.
They were often typically very active churches. They weren't churches that had been abandoned. So they were locally a big story, but they weren't nationally a big story. So how many in total would you ever able to identify?
Yeah. So again, this data, it's not that I went through and kind of identified myself. The beauty of this, and one of the reasons that I jumped on the opportunity to write about this, is that finally we had some official data, because a lot of people were compiling, doing it yourself. And so what came out was that we had a total of 238 arsons at religious institutions in the 2021, 22, 23 time period. We don't have data yet for 2024. I expect the data to be about the same. But just to give you a sense of context, if we think of sort of church arson as a baseline, from a baseline perspective, we usually have about between 35 and 40 every year in, year out. And we're able to do that and track that data. What we saw is that in 2021, it jumped to 90. So more than doubling from baseline, and it has remained high since then at around 74, 75. So what we're seeing is this trend line that's pretty steady over the last 10 or 12 years, and then suddenly this spike in 2021, and that remains high for 2022 and 23. So we're talking about hundreds of churches here. Now, one of the things that is of interest is, unfortunately, is that the data set that we're working with, which comes from Stats Canada, from Statistics Canada, for those of you outside of Canada, that is the National Statistical Agency for Canada, is not able to identify the faith or denomination of the churches or mosques or synagogues or other religious institutions that are actually the subject of arson. That data simply is not available, and it's one of the shortcomings of our of our statistical keeping, both from a fire perspective, also from a criminal perspective. And it's one of the things that I talk about is that it just doesn't make sense from a security perspective, from a social policy perspective, to have in spite of the jurisdictional issues that come from a federal country such as Canada, one of the first recommendations is, Canada, we have to get our data together, and we have to be able to have much better, comprehensive national crime and fire statistics, so that one of the problems is that it's possible, Ken, that we're having this at a high profile locally, but that signal of that uptick wasn't going up further enough because we just simply didn't have the data, or it was badly reported, or it was very out of date. And so that's one of the first things is good policy making requires good data. And if we don't have the good data, we're not going to have the good policy, or we're going to have a policy that is too late, which is sort of what we're dealing with here.
That's very, very fair. So, Edgardo, I'm just going to sort of play the old man card here for just a second, because the benefit of being around a long time is you get to watch these things evolve. And I actually remember a time when Canada was quite a religious country. In the 1960s and 1970s, church attendance was actually very, very high. It's fallen incredibly low now. I think it's something less than 10% of Canadians who go to church on an annual basis. So for a long time, religion was very active. The leaders of the Anglican Church, Catholic Church, United Church had a pretty prominent public policy role. Doesn't really happen very much anymore, which is kind of one of the saddest pieces of the last 30 or 40 years. But there's also sort of become in government policy a bit of I wouldn't say an anti-church bias, but it's a neglect of the church sort of orientation, where people just don't look at this and say, well, that's a church burning, that should be taken very seriously. We would have taken it very seriously in the 60s, not so much now, which is this kind of an interesting thing. But there's also other ambiguities. On the one hand, churches were very actively involved in residential schools. So the targeting of the churches as a response to residential schools makes a certain amount of sense. Arson never makes sense, never justified, but you can understand the connections between those things. But the other part of the ambiguity is that the Indigenous communities are actually very active in churches. When the Pope came, they showed up by the thousands of people. The United Church and Anglican Church have very strong Indigenous presbyteries. They have strong local churches that are controlled by or run and served by Indigenous ministers. So there's been this sense that all First Nations, all Métis, all Inuit must really hate the church. Well, no, actually, a whole bunch of them are very active in the church. And I wonder, does any of that help explain the ambiguous response of policymakers? They don't seem to get religion anymore.
Possibly. Look, the motivations, I didn't really get into the motivations as to why there's been, a lack of response. What I did do, Ken, is I contrasted it with what has happened, or what had happened recently in the U.S., yes. What had happened also, a country that I'd looked at as well, but did not include in the report, is in Norway, where there was a, so to speak, a spark, pardon the pun, of public policy outrage that filtered up to the policymakers to actually be able to do this. And just as an aside, one of the things that to me was shocking was that, the church, and again, it's mostly churches, though we don't have the specific numbers, but in terms of religious institutions, the policy response, there can be the kind of like condemnation, let's talk at the moral suasion discussion, which as you say, has been ambiguous. But for me, I wanted to focus on the material aspects, right? I'm not a cultural expert. I'm not a media expert. I'm not going to discuss what could have been said, what words could have been used. I wanted to get into the nitty gritty of it. And one of the things that is shocking to me was that, the number of charges, arson-related charges, to correspond to those 238 church burnings, religious arson, in 2021, 22, and 23 has only been 9. So that means that we're talking about a 4% charge rate, right? So a 4% charge rate. So like, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. I mean, the idea that you're only charging 4% of the arsonists who committed these crimes speaks for itself, that there has been a systemic underappreciation of the importance. And that's what my concern is, right? Like, I'm not coming at this from, obviously I care about law and order, but I'm not coming in from a law and order perspective, Ken. I'm coming at this from somebody who cares deeply about reconciliation, and that this lack of comprehensive policy response is actually potentially going to hurt the path to reconciliation. And so that's, I state that loudly in the report, and that's where I'm coming from, right? Like, as in, the lack of response plays into the hands of people that would want to make the path to reconciliation harder and more difficult. And that's my concern. My concern is that from a policy perspective, we should be much more active on this, not only because arson is a crime and it's dangerous and it has a property cost, but also fundamentally because it could endanger our path to reconciliation, which is tough enough already. So we have to be able to be active on this, to be able to ensure that there are no reasons why people should be opposed to reconciliation as a result of the church arsons, because some people are using it from that perspective.
I want you to dig into that a little bit, because that's a really, really important sort of question. So, okay, some people would argue the churches were involved in residential schools. They did a lot of the damage, a lot of the deaths of the children, a lot of the abuse and all that kind of stuff. Therefore, this is a long-term, long-delayed quid pro quo. And so, yes, it's a sad, unfortunate thing, but the churches deserve some sort of punishment. I want you to explore that question of why, because I agree with you, by the way, why this interferes with reconciliation. Because some people would say, well, it's moving the churches off the table. It's pushing them off into the background. So reconciliation doesn't need the churches. It doesn't have to have the churches involved. So how do you elaborate on your main point, which I think is very valid and interesting?
Well, look, I mean, so first of all, again, let's just go back to the data, right? And so let me just put that on the side. I will address that point, but what does the data do? Like, so look, I mean, these are all extremely sensitive subjects. The idea of potential unmarked burials or graves in the context of all the stories that came out in 2021 are disturbing and shocking and sensitive. And so there's been both from the cultural left and from the cultural right, there's been a very vigorous debate about the meaning of and the use of the terms associated with potential unmarked graves or burials, right? So let's call it a lot of qualitative noise. And in that context, I wanted to provide some quantitative signal, right? And so I'm not dealing directly with that issue of the potential unmarked graves, but what I wanted to do was to try to bring some social science rigor into, and which is what my job is, regular 9 to 5, is to try to bring some social science rigor and look at this from a statistical perspective. So the first thing that I did was persuade myself, and I don't think anyone else needed to be persuaded, but I wanted to present the numbers and persuade myself that what we saw in 2021, 22, 23, from a church arson perspective was unusual and out of trend and what I'm going to call excess, right? So first of all, is this an issue? First of all, good. Second issue was, what's causing it, right? And so one of the things that we all believe, and I believed at the time, that there was somehow relation to the announcements. So the church burnings and the announcements were related. And so, but no one has actually done that statistically. Like, no one has done that from a causal perspective, looking at statistical analysis. So I did that, right? And I persuaded myself that, yes, in fact, I mean, maybe it's like arguing the obvious, but no one had done it causally. And I did that, and I persuaded myself that is the case. What I also did is I looked at other things. For example, were these arsons occurring in the United States? Were they occurring in England?
Yeah.
Is this something that was happening across the world, or at least the Anglosphere, that's really not a Canada-specific issue? So I eliminated that possibility, looking at the US and England. I also looked at France. So no, this is a Canada-specific thing. It is out of trend. And so then what were the causes, and what if commentators, again, on the cultural left and right, talked about is, well, it could be residential schools announcements, or it could be like an upswing in anti-religious hate crime, right? So those are the two motivating factors that have been put out there. And so I tested them both statistically. And what I found was that, yes, I found evidence in the data to support the first hypothesis, but I did not get evidence on the data to support the second hypothesis. So this is primarily an issue of the announcements. And then I do some fast statistical work to actually prove that. Now, proving that statistical relationship is not causality, but it's sufficient in my own mind to persuade us as a country that we should act on this.
Yep.
Right? So that's the first thing. So is it enough to act on it? It is. And the question of how we act on it, I think, is also important. And we can certainly discuss that as well. But again, one of the things that's happening is that, my evidence is circumstantial, so to speak, right? Like, I haven't interviewed the people that have done the arsons. I don't know what is in their minds. And not only that, but we also have, like I said, 4% solve rate, which means that we don't really know who's doing this. We know that it's somehow related to, to the announcements, but we don't know the specific motivation. Is it mostly, people who are anti-religious? Is it, an upsurge in satanic cults that were responsible for many of the church burnings in the U.S. in the 1990s? Is it mostly Indigenous people? Is it mostly non-Indigenous allies of Indigenous people who believe that this is the right thing to do? So that motivation is not there. We don't know it. It's a mystery. Further, unlike other sort of organized crimes, we don't have any group, announcing responsibility.
Yeah.
Right? Because often what you have is, when it's organized, usually you have a group saying, hey, we're doing this for this reason or for this reason. So we have none of that.
So it's so interesting, because what you're essentially telling us is that your report, you hope, is going to be the start of a process, not the end of a conversation.
Correct.
In other words, there's a big issue here. It's related to the unmarked graves controversy and discussion. We don't know who did it, what their motivations were, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, and I'm you didn't say this, but I'm going to say it. If we don't respond to these kinds of things, we're going to have more of them. It'll happen over a longer period of time. So I'm really interested in your policy response.
Yeah.
You give some very specific suggestions on what should be done. So give us your top three sort of policy responses that you think will help address this. I'm sure number one has to do with data.
That's exactly. Look, again, why do I think we should act? That the cart has not left the barn yet. Like, first of all, there's no statute of limitations on arson, right? So like, arson that occurred back in 2021 can still be prosecuted now, right? And so that is an important aspect. But my concern is this. My concern is that there's going to be more announcements of potential unmarked graves, and there could be down the road a possibility that, given what you talked about, Ken, that there were burials at or near residential schools, that I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that in the next few years we're actually going to have verified human remains. And in those, if there are exhumations. So if my model, which links the announcements of these unmarked graves and associates them with arson, if that has any predictive value, that tells us that in the future, with increasing number of of announcements of potential graves or actual verified human remains, we're going to see a commensurate uptick or an increase of arson at religious institutions. That is what we have to be prepared for. We have to be prepared to deter, prevent, and prosecute those arsons with a view for them not to happen, unlike before. Because what was happening before, ultimately, when you have a 4% solve rate, is that they were happening with impunity.
Yeah, nobody's making an effort to track them down.
And so there's no deterrence effect, right? Yep. And so other than the data, which I've already discussed, and I don't want to bore people with, oh my God, more data, because the guy's coming from an economist perspective. The number one thing is that we know what works with respect to deterrence, right? And what works with deterrence is not increasing the potential penalties of a crime. It means increasing the probability of being caught. Right. And so what we found in Canada and what we found in the US with respect to arson, again, in the 1990s, the US had a very big spike in arson, predominantly at Black majority congregation churches in the South. Okay. And so in the 1990s, this was a national issue. Bill Clinton, the president at the time, considered it a priority. And so he did, with congressional approval, he set up a task force, FBI, ATF, and a series of municipal and state troopers to investigate this issue. And so what they were able to do with this task force, specialized personnel, budget, and some legal changes, was that they were able to staunch this uptick. And so bring down the number of arsons from the hundreds to the dozens. Right. And they did that fundamentally by catching the arsonists and by deterring the arsonists. And so increasing the solve rate from, in the teens to the 40s. Right. So, this is not magic. If you have a problem, first of all, you've got to identify the problem. You've got to catch the signal. And B, you've got to figure out how to do it. And we don't do that by increasing or proposing to increase the penalties. What you do that is by getting a regional or national task force of RCMP, of provincial police, of municipal police, both on the police investigation and fire investigations, which is a specialized field, and bring them together. Because one of the problems that we have is we have a patchwork of jurisdictions.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's going to be surprised in Canada talking about a patchwork of jurisdictions. Well, we have a classic patchwork of jurisdictions where we have a criminal, a federal level criminal code, unlike the United States, but we have who does the policing. It's at the provincial or federal or provincial and municipal level. We don't have any kind of federalized fire institution, and yet, it's done by hundreds of thousands or thousands of fire services. So in that jurisdiction, we need to bring these integrated units with police and fire that are dedicated, that are specialized to investigating these and prosecuting them. And because right now you could increase, your maximum penalty from 14 years, which is the current in the criminal code, to 25 years. But if your chances of being caught are 4%, it's not really the deterrence. So that's the number one. The number one recommendation is this is an issue. It has criminal, financial costs, but primarily it has a potential cost with respect to reconciliation. And so therefore we should act on it. And the way we act on it is by increasing the probability of being caught, therefore deterring and catching serial arsonists. This is the other issue. There are serial arsonists out there, I'm sure. There was a guy in the US that was caught by the FBI in the context of these church burnings that had burnt down 50 churches, 50. So the way in which you stop a serial arsonist from doing it again is to catch them, because otherwise they're not going to be dissuaded, right? And so we've got to catch the first time offenders, and then we've got to catch the serial arsonist, and we have to bring that down, that criminal, we have to bring up the solve rate and bring charges and make them very public to dissuade future arsonists from doing exactly this, in response to what I am sure is going to happen is further announcements. And so that's where we started.
Edgardo, this is wonderful. A wonderful conversation about this and a very, very important report. I'm absolutely completely agree with you that there will be other announcements for the simple reason that I'm an historian by training. We know children died at these residential schools. We know they were buried on the grounds. So remember, the Cowess's First Nation was one of the first ones to report this, and the chief of Cowess's, Macdonald-Laurier, a wonderful young leader from southern Saskatchewan, he said, we knew they were there. This is the burial ground. We'd lost sight of the markers, and now this is reminding us to go back and sort of see what we can do to sort of rebuild the memorials that are there. We're going to have those announcements. You've given us a real direction to the country to sort of take this up as a serious responsibility, a collective responsibility. It does expose yet another weakness in federalism, the scattered information, and we rarely think about that in terms of fire. Fire is, except for forest fires, the ultimate. These local fires are highly localized. They're dealt with local fire departments. There's clearly something else going on there. One of the purposes of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is to sort of, as our leader Brian Lee Crowley always says, is to make a bad public policy unacceptable. And you've identified a situation where we do not have the right public policy. You've given us a bit of a roadmap for how to deal with it. But more than anything else, I think you've really given us a call to arms. And perhaps it's a wrong militaristic reference to use in this context, but you basically told us that it'll get worse. It's not going to get better. It could get worse unless we do something about it. And I love the precision of your policy recommendations. Edgardo Sepulveda, you've done a marvelous job with this report. I invite everybody to read the whole report. It's on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's website. And I'm sure you're going to see a robust conversation coming out across the country about this in the months and the years to come. Edgardo, what a wonderful opportunity to meet with you and to discuss this very important project. Thank you very much for joining our podcast today.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to that conversation because I think it's an important one, and I think it is now the right time.
Absolutely. Ken Coates, on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thank you for being with us today.